welcome to Other Voices Online, a monthly conversation with and for activists. Other Voices Online is brought to you by Peninsula Peace and Justice Center. I'm the director of Peninsula Peace and Justice Center and your host, Paul George. Thank you all for joining us tonight. The California State Legislature passed some significant climate change legislation in its most recent session. And to top things off, the state of California has recently filed a groundbreaking lawsuit against the big oil companies for damages caused by climate change, making California the first major fossil fuel producing state to file such a suit. Taken together, the legislation and lawsuit represent big steps forward in what's known as climate accountability. Joining me to talk about this and help us understand the importance of all of it, I'm really pleased to welcome Janet Cox of Climate Action California. Janet leads Climate Action California, which grew out of the 350 Silicon Valley legislation and policy team about a year ago. She is familiar to many local activists as she lived in Palo Alto for many years, is a member of First Presbyterian Church, and raised her daughter here. Her background is in journalism and communications. In Palo Alto, she was a consultant for the wastewater treatment plant and the city's storm drain program, developing public programs promoting water pollution prevention. She's been organizing full-time on climate legislation and policy since 2014. And Janet is joining us from her home in Oakland. Janet, thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Oh, it's great to be here. And thanks for the introduction. That kind of covers it.
Yeah.
Well, I see some familiar names on the participant list, and I'm glad to see some friends here.
Oh, good. So yeah. Tell us, before we get into the nitty-gritty of legislation and lawsuits, tell us a little bit about Climate Action California. You are new. Some people may not be familiar with it yet. You're an all-volunteer organization, but statewide, this couldn't be easy to
it's not
carry out.
and we better fix that soon. Yeah, we're definitely statewide. What happened about a couple of years ago was when we were organizing with 350 Silicon Valley, the Climate Reality Project Coalition with 12 chapters around the state joined us because they wanted to do action and not just education. And they brought great volunteers to join the amazing volunteers we already had. This group has a ton of ambition and a lot of expertise, and it's really quite fun. And I hope that it's welcoming to people who aren't old hands at this. We do legislative trainings, and it's kind of having a tiger by the tail, but it's a really great tiger. So
yeah, and your focus really is on legislation in California, or do you do federal legislation as well?
Our focus is on short-lived climate pollutants, which is primarily methane and refrigerants. The third short-lived climate pollutant is soot, PM 2.5 particulate pollution, but in California, that's not as huge a problem as methane and refrigerants are. So short-lived climate pollutants, transportation, which is 41% or more of the California's emissions, and measures that speed the transition to a low carbon economy. And this sounds like a focus, but it's a pile of bills.
I'll bet.
And we're organized in teams that focus on specific pollutants or sort of categories of issues. Huh. And those teams try to work vertically. So they're looking at federal regulation and policy, my phone, as well as state regulation and policy, and often local issues and ordinances too. And I think that vertical integration makes a lot of sense because we've got to do everything everywhere. And what the feds are doing and the money that's coming in the Inflation Reduction Act impacts what California is able to do. And so that's kind of the way we organize. I mean, we definitely do more work at the California legislature level, but at the moment, as we'll talk about tonight, there's also a lot going on at the federal level we have to pay attention to. And
I don't want to spend too much time on Climate Action California, but I do want people to get familiar with it. Putting out some great information. It's some of the best legislative updates that I get, and I get a lot of them from various sources. But how do you make your decisions? Is it by consensus? You have mass meetings every month, or?
We meet twice a month on the second and fourth Tuesdays at 6 o'clock. We usually
on Zoom, I assume.
On Zoom, because we're statewide. We usually get maybe 25 people at those meetings, but it's not always the same 25. And it's kind of weird. The meetings are incredibly long because I can't get them under 2 hours. And believe me, I've tried because there's just so much to talk about.
Yeah.
And we generally pretty much agree. There have been a few times when we had to vote. I think we had to vote over what was going on with Diablo Canyon at the end of the previous session. And because we didn't agree, we didn't take a position. But normally we're pretty much on the same page and
kind of clear where you need to go, right?
Yeah, I mean, and we talk to each other all the time over email and various other phone calls. I mean, people are pretty much in touch and they're really on it. So it works.
And then does this work actually entail a bunch of you going up to Sacramento and meeting face to face with legislators or their staff?
It's very hard to get people from the Peninsula to go to Sacramento. So normally I go to Sacramento because I can get there in a little over an hour from Oakland. One of the things that we are working on is trying to get the assembly to have their meetings so that people can testify over the phone. The Senate does this, the assembly doesn't. So a lot of us turn out for Senate hearings, and I have to schlep up to Sacramento for a lot of assembly hearings, but we're trying to get that fixed.
Yeah, well, good luck on that one. Thanks. So I'll just remind our viewers that we do send out a follow-up email to everybody who registered for these webinars. So when that comes to you a couple of days after this evening, we'll include all kinds of information on how to contact Climate Action California and get involved. And they've got some upcoming trainings, and we'll include that. And then Janet's provided lots of links for more background on what we're going to talk about tonight. So let's get to some of that nitty gritty. I want to start though with this concept of climate accountability. What does that mean to you? And why is it important?
Are you asking me, or were you asking the audience?
I'm asking you.
Oh. Well, if you can't regulate it if you can't measure it, is the old saw that is really quite true. And so what the bills that the governor has just signed are about is disclosures. And accountability is right, but disclosure is the sort of the word that is used in these circles. We know there's been a vast amount of greenwashing and outright lies by the oil companies. We know that the financial institutions don't want to talk about private equity or the kinds of, how much money they're actually loaning to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry.
Uh-huh.
And these bills, which are kind of, it feels sort of miraculous that they passed, and they're probably going to get a lot of pushback before they go into effect, are going to fix that to a huge extent for the most important companies in the country. And it's incredibly important.
Great.
And it's just great to have California leading again, because we've kind of been slipping, I think.
That's a good way to put it. And we are going to talk in some depth about these transparency bills in just a little bit, but I did want to start off with the lawsuit that California has filed against all the major oil companies, because this goes right to the heart of climate accountability and the greenwashing and that sort of thing. As I mentioned briefly in the introduction, that California is the largest major fossil fuel producing state to file one of these lawsuits. There are some 40, I think, similar lawsuits from cities, counties, and other states, but the size of California and the fact that we host a lot of oil production gives us this particular lawsuit a lot of impact. Can you talk a bit about the lawsuit and what's in it and what it seeks and that sort of stuff?
Well, I've been in meetings with various people in various attorney general's offices about a lawsuit against the oil companies for more than 6 years. And they're always incredibly, well, we can't tell you what we're actually working on, but we can tell you that we're very interested in it. They've been saying that for 6 years. And all of a sudden, just before Climate Week in New York, which is always a good time to make a big splashy announcement, Newsom and Bonta came out and said they were dropping this huge suit. And it really is massive. And California has the second biggest Justice Department in the country. That's right after Maine Justice.
That's an interesting statistic.
Yeah, and if anybody can do this, I would think that we could. Plus, the 126-page brief that we'll send you all a link to that you can read in your spare time is quite gripping. I mean, they really know how to tell a story. But Paul is also right that the other states that are suing don't have the oil industry that we have here. The other states that are suing are Vermont, Connecticut, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. But California is, I think, the second biggest oil producing state in the country after Texas.
Wow.
But it's a big deal. So, and I should just say that one of the things, so we've been going to these meetings for 6 years, and we've been following the other suits that have been happening in all these other places. And up until last spring, everybody was kind of waiting to see what the Supreme Court was going to decide about where these suits were going to take place, because they were all brought in state court. And the oil companies in every case have moved to have them remanded to federal court because the nature of the nuisance and tort laws in federal court, they just figured they'd have a much easier time getting out of these suits. And so we waited and waited, everything was winding through the old process forever. And then in March and April, the Supreme Court declined to take up the oil companies' complaints. So left the suits in state court.
Ah,
At that point, we figured, okay, let's do it. Time to start leaning on California. And then some attorneys that I know in the East Coast were sort of saying, well, don't start bugging them just yet, because they think they thought this was going to come. And so finally, we've got this amazing announcement that California is going to sue. And so I've just to the battery of suits are based on a whole gamut of complaints, and they're all a little different. But if you look at them, they're based on fraud or consumer protection issues, damages, cost recovery, failure to warn, racketeering, public and private nuisance, negligence, and impairment of the public trust. And most of the suits, sort of go to one or two of those. The California suit goes after public nuisance, pollution, impairment, and destruction of natural resources, misleading advertising and environmental marketing, unfair competition, and failure to warn. Plus, it requires a gigantic, I hope, abatement account, which is a huge pile of money that the losing oil companies will have to contribute to in order to pay for the both the punitive damages and the remediation that's going to be needed in the future. So it's kind of a grab bag, but it's rather well constructed. I'm not a lawyer, what do I know? I think it's really it's a hugely big deal.
Could you talk a little bit more about, assuming California wins this and gets a big pile of money? I understand, and I haven't read the lawsuit or even the gripping synopsis of it, but I understand that the abatement fund, that the money, if the monetary damages are awarded, will go into this abatement fund. They are targeting vulnerable communities first.
Well, I think they'll target vulnerable communities first, because vulnerable communities are the first communities to get hit. I mean, if you think about the shoreline around San Francisco Bay, it's the poorest communities that are going to have to deal with sea level rise. I think that's true everywhere. And I do think that the suit calls out the specific harms to those places. I mean, look at the Central Valley, where they're just surrounded by oil derricks in their backyards. Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about those oil derricks when we talk about some of the other legislation. I must say the concept of, I know it's a legal concept, but calling climate change, planet destroying climate change as a public nuisance is something that only a lawyer could come up with. I've got to say.
You have to read the definition of nuisance, but yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's certainly a nuisance, right?
And this lawsuit, as I understand it, is similar to a lot of the others, that it's based on documents that have been made public that were generated by the Petroleum Institute, and these Exxon has some rather damaging memos that have been made public, where, and I think people are familiar with this, but just confirm that this is the basis of the suit, is showing that these oil companies knew full well the threat of climate change from their product and actively lied about it, discouraged discussion of it, et cetera. If I got that right, that's
Yeah,
what
I
this
mean, they
lawsuit is
they
based on.
talked about the risk in internal emails, and at the same time, their PR departments were putting out all these happy stories about how we're just making your lives better.
Yes. So lawsuits take a notoriously long time. What kind of timeline are we looking at here?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, there's a briefing next Wednesday at noon Pacific, and Paul will send around a link to sign up for that. That's being done by the Center for Climate Integrity, which is sort of the clearinghouse for a lot of these suits. That will be a really good place to ask what they think the timeline will be. The fact that this is that these cases will not have to go to the Supreme Court will speed it up, that's for sure.
Yes.
I really don't know. So some of the suits, the Oakland and City and County of San Francisco suit was in a federal district court in San Francisco years ago, and then I think it got bumped back down to the state level, and then it had to go, then it was appealed, and then they tried to move it to the Supreme. I mean, all these cases have had this long and fraught trail through the judicial system as the oil companies' attorneys were, been trying everything. They're sort of like Donald Trump, maybe.
I was just going to say, in the era of a former president under 91 indictments, we're all becoming much more familiar with court procedures than I ever imagined.
I was telling my kids that by the time Donald Trump goes to jail, I might just take the bar for fun.
Take the bar exam. Yeah, that's really good. Let's move on to some of the legislation that the state legislature passed and that the governor signed. It wasn't guaranteed that Governor Newsom was going to sign all these, but we got a number across the finish line. The first two I want to talk about is kind of in tandem, what are being referred to as transparency bills. And this is the disclosure that you were talking about, SB 253 and 261. Can you give us the thumbnail sketch of
Sure.
what these are all about and what they do and how they provide transparency?
So SB 253 is has gotten the most press. That is the bill carried by Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco that requires any company doing business in California that has revenue from any place over $1 billion to report on their scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And it might be worth explaining what those scopes are.
Please do. Please do.
This is a system for categorizing emissions that the World Resources Institute and the greenhouse gas, what's it called? Anyway, several years ago, it's been out there for a long time. Scope 1 emissions are like the emissions that are based on your on-premises operations. Scope 2 emissions are things like emissions from a fleet that you own that drives around or something. Scope 3 emissions are supply chain emissions. And that means emissions that come from whatever goes into your products and emissions that come out of your products after they are sold. Think about gasoline.
Yes.
So so everybody's saying, we're reporting our emissions. We're reporting scopes 1 and 2. And we're going, so what? Because it's scope 3 emissions that really count. And even the American Petroleum Institute, which is one of the entities that's being sued by California, has said that scope 3 emissions is where the action is. And so Senator Wiener's bill requires reporting of scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions by all companies that are bigger than $1 billion. I think that he's given under pressure. I think he gave
doing business in California.
They have to be doing business in California, but they can get their revenue any place globally.
So they don't have to be generating $1 billion or more of income in California. If they have some part of their operation here, they come under this bill.
Yeah, and I was on a call this morning where Americans for Financial Reform are working on what they're calling an overlap study, which is going to show that more than 70%, and this is conservatively estimated, of the Fortune 1000 companies are going to have to report.
Wow.
And the reason this is important is that there's also a long project going on at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where the SEC has been trying to put forth a disclosure requirement. And they've been getting massive pushback from companies and from the Chamber of Commerce and from, the usual suspects and the people who think that ESG is a communist plot. But the fact that California is going to require disclosure of these emissions in any case ought to give the SEC a lot of heart and courage and the ability to actually do what they need to do. So that's one of the goals. Yeah,
that's very interesting that California passes a law and yet it has impact back at the federal level. Do you think do the tea leaves point at the Securities and Exchange Commission actually adopting something similar to what California is proposing here?
Well, the SEC has been scheduled to release their rule in October, but now they've delayed that. December.
So maybe they're rewriting and
I think they might be just recalculating and figuring that, California is big enough to make a difference.
That's one thing to keep in mind here. So there's another transparency bill that's somewhat similar. This is SB 261, and this will require corporations to report on climate-created risks to their businesses. How does this piece fit in?
Well, this fits like a glove with 53. It's really amazing that we've got these. So both of these bills were brought up in the last session, and neither one of them made it through. They had different numbers. We were glad to see them come back this year. I can hardly believe still that they both passed in the first year of the 2-year session. But SB 261 is extremely important. The bill requires companies that are bigger than $500 million, same deal, doing business in California, but getting their revenue anywhere, to report on their climate-related financial risk. And that is a different calculation from emissions. But what it means is that the businesses that have to report on the risk and also need to report on what they're doing to reduce that risk in the future are going to be pushing on all of the people in the companies in their ecosystem to get with it on climate. And so and I actually have been working harder on 261 than on 253, because I'm sort of a climate finance nerd, and this is what I've been working on for several years. But together, these bills are amazing. And I haven't really figured out, one of the things that I want to find out from the from some conversation we have to have in the future about this is which of the bills is going to really require disclosure of financed emissions. Financed emissions, for instance, are the emissions that come from a project that a bank lends money to fund. See this as either part of the climate financial risk disclosure or the emissions disclosure, and maybe it's both. But there's a lot of action these days to try to get the big banks to stop supporting the fossil fuel industry, and these bills are going to go a long way in the right direction to do that.
Sounds like a lot of sunshine out there for California here. Anything else on those transparency bills? I don't want to.
Well, I think that just because the governor signed them, it's not over. So both of the bills require CARB, the Air Board, to come up with some kind of a rulemaking and a scheme for implementing them. And both of them require CARB, because CARB said it was too hard for them to do this with their existing gigantic staff, require CARB to hire a third party that's supposed to be an experienced nonprofit, knows how to do this kind of reporting, to collect the reports and generate the annual public reports that the bills require. So we're going to have to be watching CARB as they choose those vendors and come up with rules that will tell them exactly how to do this. And that oil and gas and the Chamber of Commerce and the usual suspects are going to be leaning all over CARB to kind of back off.
Yeah.
The other thing that maybe it's because we've been burned lately, I kind of look every day to make sure that nobody has filed a referendum to overturn these bills.
Yeah. Interesting thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Corporations make good use of our
but it's exciting.
And big steps forward. So a couple more here that I want to bring up. It really is quite a list. I'm proud of our legislature. And there's another one. We were talking about the oil and gas wells in California and how we've got a lot of them. And SB 1167 addresses what's happening with decommissioned, closed down oil wells that are still leaking methane, especially into the atmosphere. Before we go into the details of the bill, though, this is one that your group, Climate Action California, really wanted to see pass. A lot of others did too. But you weren't sure that Governor Newsom was going to sign this. And I want to bring this up because there's a couple of steps in all this legislation. You've got to get it passed in the Senate and Assembly, but you also have to get the governor to sign it. And he's hearing from the oil companies and the Chamber of Commerce and the hedge funds and all the others. And your group and others tried to generate a number of phone calls to Governor Newsom to get him to sign it. And not only did he sign it, he mentioned the phone calls that he got when he signed it, right?
Yeah, well, there were a whole lot of people pushing on that bill because, frankly, I don't really trust this governor to do what I think he ought to do. You know, he's under a whole lot of pressure from a whole lot of people that I probably disagree with. So we were worried that he would not want to sign 1167. So a lot of people poured it on at the end. And, you know, but I can also say that, you know, I put together a petition asking him to sign SB 261 and SB 253, the disclosure bills, and we got 11,000 signatures.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
All over the country.
Yeah.
So maybe it helps, you know.
So tell us what's in 1167 and
Well,
why we need it.
1160. So why we need it is that there is a terrifying number of abandoned or idle wells in California. And what often happens is that, you know, that a big company sells them to a small company. The well is depleted. The small company goes out of business and walks away. And the closing and capping those wells and remediating the site falls on the public.
Huh.
And there is a bonding requirement in the law that has only required bonds of I think it's like $10,000 when you transfer a well or open one, which is laughably too little. So what 1167 does is it says that anytime a well changes hands, that the entity that acquires the well has to post a bond that, in the opinion of the supervisor of the division that oversees all of this, who has to do due diligence before making a decision, the bond has to be big enough to close that well ultimately. And in fact, these wells do change hands quite frequently, especially when they are sort of on their, you know, a depleted well is a well that isn't producing the way it used to, or, you know, its owner thinks it should. And so a large company will sell a depleted well to a small company that can then buy a whole bunch of these things and just run them out to nothing. The argument that the oil companies made against 1167 was that it would mean that more wells would simply be abandoned because the smaller companies wouldn't be willing to buy them. But in fact, when you post a bond, you don't post it from your savings account. You make a deal with a bondsman. I keep thinking of that guy who gave Trump his bond, but I don't think that's a different guy. I mean, it's doable.
Uh-huh.
And the fact is that the big company doesn't want to be stuck holding the bag when that well is depleted. So this is this doesn't solve the whole problem, but I think it's a good step. And we'll be talking to Wendy Carrillo, the author of the bill, who is also running for LA County Supervisor and probably wants to make her constituents happy before she shuffles off to another election, about a next step that would go a little farther. But the good news about 1167 is that it passed pretty easily through both houses. We were worried that the governor wouldn't sign it.
Yeah.
Because you never know what he's going to do, but he did.
So just again, to go back to how you opened this, California has a lot of these abandoned wells that are leaking basically methane. I don't have on my notes here, but the number is in the thousands, is it not, in California, or high hundreds?
No, I mean, I think something that I read, and it wouldn't be too hard to look it up. It's all in the bill analyses for this bill, but I think that there are like 5,000 now, and that's projected to be many times that in the next 5 or 10 years. Because the fact is that California's oil supplies are running kind of low to what they were like when Standard Oil was starting.
Yes. Okay, let's bring our audience into this. Folks, if you have a question for Janet Cox and Climate Action California, you can either click on the raise your hand button, and you'll get a message to unmute yourself when that happens, and you can just ask your question, or you can click on the Q&A button and type in your question, and I'll read them to Janet. And bring up my participant list here and see if we've got any hands yet. We do not. So while we're waiting, okay, looks like David Page. And if we can bring him on and just click when you get the message, David.
Hi, you all set?
Yeah, we can hear you. Welcome.
Hey. Hi, Janet. Hi, Paul.
Hi.
I'm really excited about 253. You talked about it already, but one thing I wanted to ask was the governor said he was going to sign it, and then he said, but I have to change some of the language before I'll agree to it. And I was wondering, Janet, was there any significant changes that he made before he signed it, or was it?
Well, a great question. No, because he can't change it. He can't amend a bill before he signs it. So what he did do was he wrote a signing statement for both 253 and 261, which have very similar language. And I'm really glad you asked this question, because I should have talked about it earlier. But the signing statement says that he isn't sure that this scope 3 reporting stuff is in it. He thinks it might be infeasible on the schedule that it is, that the bills specify. Well, this is interesting. Is he going to come back next year? Is he going to try to get somebody to carry a bill that is going to amend these bills? That's what it would take.
Huh.
I don't know. Or is he going to try to give CARB a pass on dragging their feet? We have to be watching. And actually, I was on this call this morning with a bunch of people thinking about the SEC who are worried about this. And I told them I would send an email to the authors of the two bills and just get them to confirm, which I know they will, that no, they're not about to go tinkering with the language. Because the fact is, the reporting protocols exist. There are lots of companies that already use them. It's happening in Europe all the time. The governor's just listening to the folks who don't want to report. But time's a wasting. You got to do it. But thanks for the question. It's a great question.
Yeah, thank you, David, for that question. Yeah, while you were saying that, my thought was that this kind of points up the importance of groups like Climate Action California. You're serving as watchdogs for all of us. I certainly don't want to, be checking every day, what's been filed and, this, that, and the other, as you've mentioned. So I sincerely thank you for that watchdog aspect. It's not just legislation, it's really paying attention. So we have a written question here, 1167. Is it just going forward? Does it address the thousands of orphaned wells that already exist? So,
well, it addresses those wells if they change hands.
so
It's any time a well is transferred in any way from one entity to another, the entity that is assuming that well has to post this bond. So it's not at all 100%. I mean,
those 5,000 wells that you mentioned that are sitting there decommissioned and abandoned right now, they are not covered by this until somebody tries to transfer it.
Right. That's
but
right.
Presumably it will put an end to that practice so that those 5,000 California taxpayer may be on the hook for decommissioning those, but that won't happen anymore going forward.
That's if the wells are transferred. I don't think, I mean, 1167 is a big deal, but it's not going to solve the problem.
No.
But the abatement account that comes with when we win the lawsuit,
that'll go toward decommissioning these.
This is one of the major causes that account ought to deal with.
So, an excellent question. So I don't see any more hands up and nothing in the Q&A box. So let me ask you, what are you looking for in the next session of the legislature? What are your priorities for Climate Action California?
Well, it's a scary question. There's a lot going on. So at the moment, we have a list of about 25 bill ideas that our volunteers have come up with, and they're pretty serious. And so what I'm going to be doing over the weekend with a couple of people is trying to organize that list to try to figure out what we can accomplish by yammering at public agencies, where we really do need legislation, and in the case of those potential bills, who the authors are we might propose them to. And then in the next few weeks, we're going to be shopping those ideas around to some of the legislators that we have good relations with. And that idea, that list is constructing itself. Probably by the time I got off the phone, there will be 2 more ideas on that list.
Yeah. Do you folks try to draft some of this legislation yourself, or do you just go with like a general outline to these legislators' offices?
That's a really good question. So I proposed a bill in 2018, and I was kind of shopping the outline around, and I was talking to the guy that you might remember, Kip Lipper, who has written a whole lot of famous climate and environmental bills. And I was trying to get him to write the bill. And he said, "Why don't you do it?" I said, it was one of the scariest things I ever did, was trying to write that bill. But I did it.
I'll bet.
I know. I was just like, who am I? What happens is the legislator who decides to carry it then sends a draft, whether it's written by somebody like me, which is unusual, or a staff person. It goes to Leg Counsel, which is a law firm in the Capitol that sort of comb over every bill proposal to make sure that it all fits, that it refers to the right statutes, and it's not likely to get the state sued. And so normally what I suggest to our people is that we come up with sort of a conceptual outline of a bill that we would like to see, and then in a very polite and humble way, propose it to a legislator. And if the legislator likes the idea, we pretty much lose control right then.
Uh-huh.
But the other thing that can happen is that the legislator will say, oh, are you willing, is Climate Action in California willing to sponsor this bill? Well, I know how much work it is to sponsor a bill. It's a killer.
Uh-huh.
I spent 2 years of my life getting SB 964 passed a couple of years ago. So yeah, it sort of depends. It kind of depends on your relationship with the legislator and the kind of expertise you can bring to the project. And it's hard. I mean, I think by the time I got Senator Ben Allen to say that he would carry that bill, I felt like I had accomplished one of the hardest things I'd ever done in my life.
Huh.
That was nothing to what came after. So,
Not an easy process.
Nope.
Again, grateful that there's groups like Climate Action California out there doing that. Got another one in the box here. Well, David seems to have his hand up again. Sean, let's bring David back on. David, ask your question when you open your mic up.
So I had my hand down, but sorry about that. But I did type in a question, which is about Newsom running for president. If he's going to do that, he's got to balance consideration of fossil fuel interests versus eco-environmental groups. Janet, what's your sense of how he's trying to manage that?
Oh, I wish I knew. I don't know. I always feel like Newsom is very aware of his mega rich friends and what they might like or not like. But on the other hand, he got a huge national platform when he announced the lawsuit at Climate Week in New York. And it was funny because that he was supposed to take questions from the press, but there was some kind of a glitch, and he and the New York Times reporter, David Gellis, who was interviewing, started late, and they had their weird conversation. So Bill McKibben and I had been planting press in the audience to ask him the question, are you going to sign these two bills? And it turned out that he didn't take questions from the press, but that was the first question that David Gellis asked him. And what could he say? He said, yeah, of course I'm going to sign them. Of course, I have some issues with the language. There was nothing he could do about the language.
Yes.
Man, that was one exciting moment. But I don't know.
It seems to me the answer to this is it's up to us to make him pro eco-environmental group and anti-corporate group when you get down to it.
I hope we have the power to do that.
Yeah, we don't have the money, but we've got the numbers, and sometimes that counts for something. We're almost at the end of our time. You have some trainings coming up, I think you mentioned to me, that people might be interested in, and we'll include this in the email.
We are going to, so we run trainings on the legislative process, how it works and how to get involved and how it isn't scary. And and we did one in June, I think, and I think we're going to do another one in the first week of December. I don't have a date yet, but I will let everybody know. And I mean, I got an email today asking me to set the date, and I ignored it. But so we'll definitely do that. And there are other issues that we get involved in that I'd really like to do webinars or panels on. We do a lot of work on hydrogen, which is a really interesting and kind of super important issue at this point. It's either going to reduce emissions or completely perpetuate global heating. I mean, it's just can go several different ways, but yeah, there's lots to talk about with people, and that's what we'd like to do. But I will let everybody know when we set the date for the legislative training in December.
And we'll put it on our activist community calendar and the email calendar, and let people know about it. Any closing thoughts on this form of legislative activism that you've chosen to pursue to encourage others to follow your lead and get involved in? There's all kinds of ways of addressing climate change, and these legislative steps, each one is maybe small and insignificant, but taken together, and especially coming from a state with the size and wealth of California, has an impact.
I say all the time that it's just a gift to be working on this here, because it really does matter, and we can really make a difference. And climate change is a scary subject, but I think it feels good to be working on it, and it especially feels good to be working on it in a community of other nice people who are also working on it. And that's really what Climate Action California is for. I mean, my sort of personal mission is to give everybody who wants to do something about climate something to do that feels right and is fun. Because if you're going to volunteer on climate change and it's not fun, you're just going to kill yourself. Don't even bother. It has to be enjoyable, and you have to do it with people that are good to do it with. And I think, there are a bunch of people on this call who have been working with us, who could probably give a testimonial on how fun it is. But
Well, I think that's a really good place to leave it. Janet Cox of Climate Action California. Janet, thanks so much for not only taking your time, but sharing all your knowledge about some pretty arcane stuff that it helps us all learn. Really
join me in my rabbit hole.
So this is usually the point where I say we'll be back next month with other voices, and I also usually say, but I don't know what the topic will be. But rather than that, I get to say this time we'll be back next week with a special Gaza emergency webinar with Professor Joel Bainan, Professor Emeritus of Middle East History at Stanford University. And that will be next Thursday, October 19th at 7 p.m. Watch your emails to find the link to get registered, and I'll send that out in the follow-up email as well. With that, I will thank Janet once again and bid you all good night. And thank you for joining us.
And thank you, Paul.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.